I was told that I was born at the Royal Alexandria Hospital in Edmonton. I know my mom's community is Standing Buffalo Dakota First Nation, and my dad's is Sakume Soto First Nation. I was told that I was taken about a year when I was about a year and a half. And from the information I know is like from what my sister has told me and from what my grandmother told me when I talked to her. And she said that I had been in at least 3 foster care homes. We were all at first in the same foster care home together, and then when we got split up, well, we were all apprehended at the same time, but we got split up further because my 3 older sisters all had the same father. And at the time, we were all just kids. Like, my sisters didn't understand. And she remembers the last time she ever saw me. And my mom was on the lawn of the foster care home. And she was crying. She was holding me in her arms. I was just a baby. And my sister remembers her crying. And then I guess her grandparents had come to get them. And she got in the car with my other 2 sisters, and she remembers looking out the back window and seeing my mom on the lawn of the foster care home crying. And then the car pulled away, and she realized that I wasn't going with them. And that was the last time she saw me. Because my earliest memories were of that foster care home in Calgary, Alberta. I had my aunt and uncle that were my foster parents. And I remember the process of being adopted, trying to get adopted, and it was, when I think about it now, it was brutal because I would always be selected for a visit with prospective adoptive parents, and I would always make it through the first visit. They liked me, and then they would take me out for a day, and then I would make it through that process, and then I would make it to the weekend visit with other adoptive families. And I remember at least 2 families, and I never made it past the weekend visit. And so I would never see those people again. But the day that I met my adoptive parents, as soon as I saw my adoptive father and my mother, I knew that they were the family that I was going to be with. And I was so excited. I made it through the first visit, the weekend visit, or the day visit, because we went to the Calgary Zoo. And the weekend visit, they literally, we're in Alberta and the winters are really, really cold. They couldn't get me to put my jacket on. I was holding on to the doorway because I did not want to leave them. I didn't want to leave them at all. And I knew then, because I always understood the adoption process, which is really mind-boggling now that I think about it, because I was just a tiny little kid. I was only like about maybe 4, when that all happened. So, but I remember being happy that I would have parents, a family, because that's all I knew. When I was in that foster home, I knew the difference between the kid that lived down the street. He had a mom and dad, and I knew that I didn't. And that was like my little goal in my life at that time, was I want my own family. I was adopted into a non-Indigenous family with Scottish background. I really loved my adoptive family when I first was adopted into them. I had 2 older brothers. I was the only girl. And eventually the economy in Alberta in the early 80s just went south, and that forced us to move to Toronto, where my adoptive family, my dad's his family were from, and that's where they actually were originally from. And so we moved, and that's where I grew up, and Toronto is a huge city. And I liked it there. I liked it there a lot. And then unfortunately, my adopted dad chose to abuse me at a young age when I was 11. And for a very long time, I never talked about that. I didn't know how to talk about that. And so I ignored it and just pretended it never happened. And then I continued living my life trying to fit in as an adoptee And then on top of that, trying to figure out who am I as an Indigenous person, or trying to figure that out. So there's a long period of denial, and then when I did my best to carry on with my life in those other areas, and that's actually quite a fresh topic for me, because I explained this in the gathering yesterday, that in my adoption story, there's always a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I'm at the end of my adoption story. That's how I'm describing it now, because about 2 years ago, I finally reported that crime to the police. And the police took it very seriously, and they did charge him. And we just finished the trial at the end of January. So now he's in custody in an institution. So, and since then, and through the last 2 years, my adoptive family has just not talked to me anymore. And I've really had to really find the family that I can count on as family. And that doesn't necessarily mean my biological family either, because they're not here in Ontario. So for my adoption experience, I think a lot of people would say that, well, that was a really bad experience, really terrible. And it was terrible. And so I'm still healing from that and sorting my way through it. But in a way, I mean, I have to recognize that that is part of who I am. It's made me who I am. When I was growing up, I always knew that I was Indigenous. In fact, in the first year that I was adopted to my family, apparently I went up to the TV and there was this John Wayne Western on, and it was classic. We were all watching it. I don't remember doing this, but my mom had told me the story. She said, yeah, you went up to the screen and you touched the Indians and you said, I'm not an Indian, I'm English. And everybody just laughed. And I laughed too when she told me that. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. But that means I must have had some sort of concept of being Indigenous even back then. But my adoptive family, they told me to always be proud of the fact that I was Indigenous. They were proud of that fact. And they always said that I was special, but they never explained what that meant. So, and that influenced the way I grew up in a positive way too, because I always had it in my head, like, being Indigenous is a good thing. But as I grew up in where I was in school, elementary, junior high, and then high school, I was always the only Indigenous person. And I found myself always looking around and looking to see if I could see someone else that looked like me, because it was like this mystery. You're Indigenous, but what does that really mean? And I remember in grade 8, grade 9, I was kind of used to being the only Indigenous person, but I remember starting that search for connection, because in grade 8 and grade 9, everybody started splitting up into their own little ethnic groups. And I remember trying to hang out with the Chinese people, trying to hang out with the Sri Lankan people. In Toronto, I went to a really multicultural school, and we had a multicultural day at the end of the year. So they did this big parade with all the flags, and everybody brought their ethnic food. And I don't ever remember seeing someone else, like an Indigenous person, or connecting with an Indigenous person while I was in high school. I don't think I really, I can't say I remember, like, images, or I think my spirit remembers more than I do, and sometimes just the feelings, because I was so young when I was taken. And I'm an artist, I'm a storyteller, and I actually did write about that process about being separated from my mom. The question about where I am at home, like, I live here in Ottawa and I've been here for 17 years, I think. Well, since 98, however long that works out to be. And so a lot of people would think that this is my home now. And yet I've lived here. I do live here, but it doesn't feel like home either. That was the other distinction I wanted to make, is like, this is where I live. And I think about too that I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, and I went back there for the first time about 3 years ago, since I was taken from that land. And that land knew me when I went back. So did Saskatchewan. When I spend time there, if I spend enough time there, I can feel a connection to the land. But again, it's a complicated I find it's a complicated question because I live where I live and I visit where I visit, but I can't really say this is home. But I know everyone that is connected to me biologically or adoptive, they've all got their opinions. Oh, you're home now. And that's not necessarily true. I remember I was in Toronto when the first Sky Dome powwow happened. And by that time, I was like out of school. I started going to the Native Canadian Centre. And again, it was strange because everyone that's Indigenous from Toronto, they're either Ojibwe or from this area. But they knew that I'm Indigenous, but I'm not from this area. And so they could see that. And again, there was that thing, I'm like, okay, so I am like you, but I'm not like you. And I don't understand. And I remember I was just telling somebody this story that when I went to the Sky Dome powwow, I also got my first Native boyfriend, that was fun, sort of. And I'd never been in a room full of that many Indigenous people in my entire life. I remember just staring at all the dancers, and I remember walking around the Sky Dome, and I could hear this guy. He was in his regalia, he was a fancy dancer, and he had his bells around his ankles, and all I could hear was boom, boom, and I kept looking, and I was like, and then finally he came around the corner. Absolutely beautiful, but he had his face all done up with his face paint. And I was terrified. And the guy just looked at me because I could tell that he could see. And he was like, he didn't understand why I was so terrified. And I knew why I was terrified because I'd never been in a room full of Indigenous people that many before. It's funny now, but at the time, I didn't know. It just felt so strange. For as long as I can remember, I've always wanted to find my birth mother. And again, with these questions, they're not very easy to answer. They're complex, and there is no straightforward answer, yes, no. When I was growing up, I never thought about my biological father. For whatever reason, I was always focused on trying to figure out, where's my mom? And unfortunately, when I was growing up, adopted, you're always made aware that in subtle ways that you're different. You're not like everybody else. When I loved my adoptive mom, and every holiday, every Mother's Day, it just highlights it, but nobody ever talks about it. And there was this one Mother's Day, and I had gotten through all these holidays, and in the inside, I always think about my biological family, like, it's impossible not to. I'm celebrating Christmas with this family, but on the inside, I'm secretly wondering, where is anybody looking for me? Is anybody aware? Does anybody miss me? And this one Mother's Day, I just remember feeling this tremendous amount of sadness. And I didn't know why. And it was the only Mother's Day where I actually sat next to my adoptive mom. And I was actually honest with her, and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, I'm not okay." And I just started crying. And I couldn't explain why I was crying because I'd never cried before. And, she's like, "No, but, I love you." And I was like, "Yeah, I know you love me," but it was just a hard day. And what I found out later was, it was about 3 or 4 months later, I found out that was the day that my biological mom had died. And I had felt it. And I've never felt anything like that in my entire life. And then it was shortly after that, that's how I was connected to my biological family, was through my status card. And that's how I got the confirmation. I sent away for my status card because I needed my status card if I wanted to go to post-secondary education. And once I had done that, I got a phone call from my band office saying, "So, we've got your application. You're all good to go. And by the way, I'm your cousin. And you've got 3 older sisters that have been looking for you. They've been waiting for that card to come in because they knew that I'd been adopted out." And I was just blown away. I was like, what? No, this was not what This isn't how I imagined this was going to be. I thought that my adoptive family and I had always talked about, one day you and I, we're going to go out together as a family and we're going to go find your biological family. But that's not what happened. My dad was just a dad that just took off when I was born. And I realized when I really wanted to find him, I waited until I was a year old in my sobriety, which was about 6 years ago. And I realized it's now or never. I don't know how much time I have left. I don't know how much time he has left. I know how to find him. So I basically called him up and said, so what would you say if I was going to come out there and visit you, for a couple weeks, maybe a week? Because by now I'd found out that he was married with a wife and they had kids, and all her kids think of my dad as their dad. So basically I just kind of showed up one summer and said, hi, I'm here to get to know you. I kind of laugh about it now and I joke about it too, because I can imagine that my stepmother probably wasn't that thrilled that I showed up. But I found out, thankfully, I did do that because I found out that I am my dad's oldest child. And then I had another half-sister and another half-brother. So I'm glad I made that effort, and so now I do have a connection through there. I would say the things that have impacted me from being adopted out of my community, I would say now as an adult, even though I was reconnected to my community through my status card, that doesn't mean that I'm actually a person. It means, like, it took me a long time to just even go back and visit. I go back maybe once a year. And even though my mom's been gone for over 20 years, and I've met slowly over time some of her brothers and sisters, they know me, but the community doesn't know me. And even my real biological name, I do know it. I can't pronounce it. I can't pronounce my last name. They all laugh at me too. Even if I was to change my name back to my biological name, it doesn't feel right, and nobody would know who I am. So I'm kind of stuck in this place where I know I exist. I have a right to go back there and live, but the community, I can't say that the community's welcoming. I don't want to say that in like a negative sense. It's just, there doesn't seem to be a clear doorway to go back. Like, oh, it's an adoptee, come back and live among us and, make your home here, come back home. I haven't felt that. There's not an easy way to transition back to that life if I was going to do that. Definitely the other impact would be the loss of the culture and language. Standing Buffalo Dakota First Nation. Ever since I found that out, I've been constantly educating everybody that I've ever encountered with that, because a lot of people aren't aware that there are at least 6 reserves in Canada that are Dakota. Because most people are under the concept that we're all down south, and it's not true. So I'm always put in this position of explaining myself, like, you come from where? And how does that work? And then it's a full stop, because I don't speak the language. And if I want to learn the language and the culture, I probably will have to move back. But for now, I don't really know what's going to happen with that. So yeah, those would be my 2 biggest impacts, because I can identify as being Dakota, but that doesn't mean that I know the language or the culture. But I am learning. What I did get to know about my sisters, eventually we talk about our mom and finding out what they think and feel about their relationship with my mom, because they knew my mom. They knew what she was like. And I don't know any of that. And any time they ever talked about my mom, I was just like a sponge, just wanting to know any information about her, because I had nothing. I had nothing to go on except other people's memories. About 2 summers ago, my stepmother, my dad's wife, said, "Oh, I know your auntie. She goes to bingo. I see her all the time. Do you want me, the next time you're down, do you want me to give her your number, or, I'll get her number and I'll give it to you?" And she said, and I said, yeah, sure, because I hadn't met her at this point. And then, so we got connected, And I ended up being connected to my aunt very quickly. We met at a Chinese food restaurant at a buffet place. I remember walking in, I remember seeing my aunt, and for me, seeing my aunt was like seeing my mom. I couldn't help but compare the two and just automatically think, oh my God, it's like meeting my mom for the first time. And I was crying, and my aunt was just like, you know, she was happy to see me, but she's like, oh, there'll be time for tears later, don't worry. And we only had that, like, I think only 2 hours together that day. And she said, you know what? And this was in April, and she said, come back. If you come back out this summer, I will put you in regalia and I'll take you on the powwow trail. And I said, really? I said, you have no idea what that means to me. Like, I don't dance, I don't participate. I would go to powwows, but not, I don't have any of that stuff. I said, are you serious? She's like, yeah. And so I did. I went out that year on my birthday. I showed up at the White Bear First Nation, and they picked me up at the bus station. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really happening. This is really happening. And sure enough, she stayed true to her word. She put me in, I had long hair then, and she taught me exactly how to do everything from the feet all the way up, how to dress, how to undress, what to do when you go in. And so I learned that summer about that entire culture. And it did change my perspective. I was like, oh my gosh, I felt so privileged and so, because unless you know somebody, like I've always lived in the city, I'm an urban Indian. So unless you know somebody who's already in that circle, the powwow circle, that lifestyle, I don't see any way how do you get in there unless somebody gives you that offer. And because she did that, I'm still connected to the adoptees here in Ottawa, and they were so excited for me. They were so happy, and they said, we want to hear about this when you come back. Like, what was it like? Did you get welcomed back into the community? And well, no, because I didn't want to make a big fuss or anything. It was enough to be there, to be put into that. And so that was a couple of years ago, and so now I realized what a huge opportunity that was. And not everybody gets that, so I'm very grateful. What do I need to heal from that disconnection? I've definitely felt that disconnection all my life. And even knowing, like internally in my spirit, knowing that my mom had passed, I still needed to heal from that. I think what's helped with my healing process is that talking to other adoptees. I remember being here in Ottawa and meeting with other adoptees in 1999, 2000, and there was a healing circle for anyone that was adopted, and that's where I met a lot of adoptees, and we all went through this circle. And I remember I was just young then. I was like in my early 20s, and I couldn't go there. I couldn't go there and talk about that stuff, and I would binge drink afterwards because it was hard, even though I had other people that had similar experiences. But out of that, there was a group. We decided to actually make a group called Connecting with All My Relations. And to this day, some of us are still in contact. And I remember now, when I look back, that actually helped, being able to talk about that. Because it's not something that just starts and ends. I think some people would think, okay, so well, but you know your mother's dead. Like, she's passed. Her funeral was like in 96. You know, it's done and gone, but it's not. And for myself, I'm an artist, I'm a storyteller, and I carry all these stories and these experiences. And I like the term lived experience because that's something that I actually do storytell about, is that it's really a grief process. I was taken from my mom. An elder had explained to me one time, and she was a complete stranger. I told her a little bit about my story, and she just pointed it out, and it was marvelous that she had done this because she said, you've never been allowed to acknowledge the loss of your bond to your mother. And she was absolutely right, because even though I'd been adopted and I had a new adoptive mother, even they didn't talk about it. There was no talking about You didn't exist before we picked you. You didn't exist. You didn't have a life before we adopted you. And then when you got adopted, we are your world. You shouldn't be thinking about anyone else. What features would I like to see as part of the class action lawsuit that's currently before the court system? That's a really interesting question because it sort of makes the assumption that I'm wanting to be a part of the class action lawsuit, and I've been wavering on that. It's a good question to ask. Because I am an adoptee that has been repatriated with my biological family, and I think I've said this before, is that not everybody gets that opportunity. So I've been fortunate enough to know what my reserve is, my nation. I can learn my language and my culture. That's up to me, and I understand that. And I do have my connections to everybody that I choose to connect with. So that leaves me, I've been thinking about that because it's hard to not see the headlines about this case. I don't come from a place that's angry or bitter. I think that if I wasn't connected to my biological family on any of that level, if I didn't know what my reserve was, if I didn't have any of those answers, I think I would be in a different frame of mind, and I probably would be one of the people asking, well, I need money, or, or I need healing. And the only thing I can think of right now is that I know the power of being in groups where people can get together and just share about their experiences. Because I know that for myself, any group that I've ever been a part of, the moments I learn and the moments I connect with is when I connect with somebody else and I say, this happened to me, and that look on the other person's face and they say, that happened to me too. And then you feel a connection, and then I find myself wanting to know more about them. And those are the moments that I've grown the most and that I think have helped me. And that type of group thing, that can happen with any type of group, whatever it is you're in a group thing for. And I think that would be my only recommendation is make those gatherings happen for these people. No, I don't like the word conferences, but gatherings specifically for adoptees. And I think there should be a way for adoptees to come back to their reserves. There should be something in place. I do remember talking to my chief at one point, and he knew who I was, and I was introduced, and it turns out his wife is my cousin. It's so true. Everybody's a cousin. And I met him just before the very first adoptee gathering here in Ottawa a few years ago. And I remember I was talking to everybody about that gathering, saying, if you want to come to Ottawa. We're doing it in the fall. Please come. And I remember talking to him about it, and he said, I didn't get a welcoming back ceremony. The chief just kind of said, oh, okay. Hey, welcome back. I was like, wow, that was a bit of a letdown. There's something in me that wants more, that there should be something from the community. There should be something in place, but it seems like the community doesn't care about us as much because I haven't seen much of a response. And I've talked to other adoptees and I've heard that as well. We want to go back. We want to be connected. And somebody had also suggested to me that it was perhaps, well, maybe they're afraid of all these adoptees coming back and using up the resources and wanting to move back. But I think that that's not a good perspective. It's the connection. We just want to know. We just want to be welcomed back. So yeah, I think those two things, healing and a way for us to come back to our communities. Or at least an invitation, that we matter, because that's what it is. We matter to somebody.